Well, it's my real privilege to be able to share with you today on surrendering to Jesus. I'd love to frame this with a scripture, which we find in Mark's Gospel in chapter 8. In verse 34, Jesus is speaking to the crowds, and he calls the crowd and he calls his disciples to him. He has something important to say. And he says this: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." To understand this, we must recognize we can look at this through the lens of knowing what happens to Jesus on the cross, which comes later in the story. But at this point, the disciples don't know where this is going. The cross has a particular resonance at this time. The cross is used by the occupying force that is in this land, the Romans, and it is a form of both execution but also humiliation. There are many ways in which you can take a life, but this kind of taking a life by a government is both a punishment, but it's also a propaganda. And we can read stories of people at this time walking along these roads and seeing the crosses and hanging on those crosses, criminals, but also political prisoners who have been executed. This was a form of communication, basically saying to the people to stay in line, to not push away those who they saw as oppressing them. Now, for the Jewish people, this carried an even greater symbolic meaning. In Deuteronomy, we read that actually it was a shame. It was a great humiliation. It was seen to be cut off from God if you were hung and died on a pole or a tree. We see in the great coup, the great revolution that David's son Absalom stages against his father's rule, that Absalom is then killed by himself, getting his hair caught in a tree, and he dies hanging on a tree, which sounds comical to us, and there's a bit of comedy in a sense, or dark comedy to it. But really, from a Jewish perspective, this is a way of dying which cuts you off from God. It is humiliating. So for Jesus to say to this group, particularly think about the disciples, this group of young men, to say to follow me, you want to follow me? Well, following me means that you take up your cross. The way that you will walk is not a way of growing your brand, your personality, what you think is going to happen, all the things that you wish to come true. Jesus is calling to a very different path here, and it gets stuck in our throat when we hear this now, and it would have got stuck in people's throat when they heard it at the time. Throughout church history, this is a verse which has got stuck in our throat. Why? Because it's meant to. Jesus goes on to say in verse 35, in this passage, it's this next verse is almost contradictory, and almost the paradox that is enclosed within it, again, is also given to capture our attention. It says this: "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." This is saying that the value system of the world is actually upside down. If this verse sounds upside down, that you gain your life by losing it, and by losing your life you gain a life, if that sounds contradictory, that's actually pointing the light on a world whose value system is upside down. And it speaks of a kingdom which is coming into the world, which is upturning the order. It's like coming into a store where all the prices are actually wrong, and then someone comes and puts the right prices on things, and the packet of beans is actually worth more than the Ferrari car. The world's order is out of whack. He goes on to say this: "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" It's talking here that you can seemingly, in the eyes and the measurements and the metrics of the world, seemingly have it all. You can have the power, the prestige, the knownness. You can be successful. You can ace your grades. You can kill it in whatever field you want to get into. But actually, there's a spiritual dynamic happening behind the scenes that we can miss. But Jesus is upsetting the apple cart here, and he is actually asking us to look at things in a very different way. Now, this verse is not a great verse to start a talk with in how we understand talks. Normally, if you're speaking to an audience, you want to start with a story with connection point. I cut my teeth in lots of young adult ministry. I spoke to groups like you for many years when I was beginning my ministry, going into university groups, going and speaking in high schools, and speaking to groups of people where you had to gain their attention because often they were distracted. And so I learned the ways of speaking and how you use your voice, and I would have different stories that were really interesting or funny that would capture people. But they don't seem appropriate after this verse, because this verse is actually speaking in a very different tone. And in many ways, I think this is an appropriate tone. For my real heart here is to actually not to speak to you as a speaker or an author or someone who is, I don't know, some figure. I actually want to speak to you in a way that comes from my culture. I travel to the US a lot and speak in America often. I've done it for years. But it's been really interesting in this last season as I've been unable to travel because of the pandemic, and I'm actually speaking to you from my context here in Melbourne, in my Australian culture. When I go to America, I have learned how to use certain words that we wouldn't use in my culture, but I've learned to speak American English in some ways or translate into it, and also understand American customs and culture. But I want to speak in a way to you today that comes from my culture. One of the great cultural foundations for Australian culture is a word that begins with M. It's mate. It sounds like friend, but it means so much in my culture. So much of Australian culture is based on people seeing themselves as mates. We call it mateship. And it's this egalitarian foundation for how we deal with other people. So when you're talking to a mate, mates talk in a way which is honest. We tell each other the real stuff. If you have a mate, you're called to be loyal to them. That's my Australian culture. And you're called to tell them what you really think. So when you've got a mate in Australia, you communicate them in a really honest and direct and loving way. And so I don't want to talk to you today as a speaker or come in here and tickle your ears and entertain you. I want to speak as a mate, and I want to speak plainly. Why? Because I believe we're in a moment. We're in a key, pivotal moment in history. You are in university and you are learning how, whatever you're studying at this point in time, but you're also learning so much more. You're being formed in a particular way to then enter into the workforce, into the world at an absolute axial moment in history. Now, this has been said often. I bet you if you went back and listened to various speeches given to college groups over the years, that would have been repeated many times. You're at this key moment in history. But as someone who, as part of what I do, is study history and study culture and ask what the kingdom of God and the gospel speaks into it, we really are at a shift moment. We're coming to the end, I think, of a period of history which has gone for about 3 or 4 decades. I won't go into all the details now. This is not the goal of my talk, but to say we're coming to the end of this period where there was a great story in the world, and the story in the world was the world is getting better. We're getting better technology. The world's moving together. The planet is globalizing and things are slowly improving. And we're all going to slowly just slide like a car on ice towards a better future without much effort. And all the good news stories that the world was going to get better of what we have been immersed in. For you, in college age groups, this is all many of you have known. And so stories in the last couple of generations are how you were going to go out into the world and you're going to achieve your dreams and you're going to do what you want. You can be anything. But then there's this background music which has been slowly getting louder, while that dominant myth is you are the most important person in the world and you can achieve anything. And there's been this dissonant music growing in the background of a world which does not look like it's getting better. We have not just one challenge, but numerous challenges before us. The world for the last 2 years has gone through a global pandemic. We are in a world where the model of the world, as we have understood it, which seemingly delivers us this wonderful world, where I can click on something here in Australia on Amazon and it can come from China to America to my house, and I don't even notice this process. It's going to be here really quickly. That world is starting to come under strain. We have rising geopolitical tensions in the world. We have environmental challenges. We have cultural challenges. We have injustices and things that we thought had, in a sense, been conquered as humans educated themselves to being better, that actually the education cannot necessarily change the human hearts. And things like sexism and racism and injustice and poverty still persist. And all of these things at this time come into some kind of blender where we live in this digitized age where all of them are coming at us through our phones, through our computers, through our TV screens continually, and it's this constant barrage. So many of you no longer buy the myth that you're entering into this world which is going to be wonderful and shiny and sparkly. And so this mythology of individualism, that it's all about you, that you can make it all happen, starts to increasingly seem fraught and even fake as this louder noise in the world of the things that are going wrong is happening at the same time. We are in a moment. Now, this moment can raise anxiety in people as you look out and think, oh my goodness, how am I going to deal with this? So what's happening is those two stories I just said, the individualist mythology and ideology of our day, and the fact that the world is looking more fraught and concerning and risky, those two things are bouncing off each other. And it's giving a message that in order to be a human being, we can hold those two things together. So what you need to do is keep pursuing your individual dreams, but you need to kind of create a kind of comfort zone, a protective bubble, where these things don't come in and affect your personal world. But that increasingly looks difficult. Now, we're in a moment. And in this moment, those pressures are actually also coming on people of faith. We are seeing all kinds of cultural pressures, political pressures, and we're seeing people beginning to see those pressures affect perhaps even your peers. Where you're seeing people walk away, you're seeing churches under pressure, you're seeing institutions, denominations, and churches polarized at this time. So when you look out on the landscape and you think of the world you'll be graduating out into, it can seem concerning. But at the same time, there's an invitation. Because if you look at the history of God's people, and there's these key moments where actually God turns things around, they rarely ever happen when everyone's comfortable. They rarely ever happen at moments when the culture's got it all together. They rarely ever happen at moments of peace and prosperity. In the 18th century, there was a great worldwide movement of the gospel that went out and went all around the world. Not far from here, where I am here in Melbourne was barely settled and the city was only being established, and this seemed like the planet Mars compared to Europe or America. There were people on horseback who were coming out and bringing the message of Jesus Christ. There were Aboriginal tribes here who were beginning to read the scriptures and encounter God. All over the world, through these networks that this global empire had created in the 18th century, God did this really unusual thing where he almost turned it inside on itself, where it went out and God used those sinews that had gone into the world and actually turned them on their heads. And there were people who were making money and power off that network, but then there were people who were at the bottom who heard the gospel. The convict in Australia, the person in the Caribbean who'd been taken from their home. And this incredible movement of the gospel, which was the upside down kingdom, happened at that moment. We see that again and again in history when there are moments of conflict, pandemic, polarization. They're the exact moments that God actually begins to turn things around. So in this moment, there is a mission. This is not a moment to hold back and reel back and hold back in this sense of this anxious fear of what the landscape looks like. Is it concerning? Yes. But these are exact moments that Jesus turned things around. And what you see in history, at the moments when people are writing the epitaph of the church, that they're the exact moments when God turns denominations around, churches around, people around. But how does that begin? So we see that we're in a moment. This is a moment of great cultural stress, political stress, geopolitical stress, environmental stress. We recognize that moment. We recognize that we are called by Jesus Christ to go into the world, to preach his gospel, to make disciples of all nations. We see a world which desperately needs God's justice. We see a world which is hungry for the ways of God's kingdom, which is seeing the problems, and we increasingly capture how bad the world is on a cell phone video and send it around the world. Yet we also see that we seem to fall short of actually rectifying these problems, and we become more divided. So there is a moment, but there's a mission. And there's a mission that we are called to actually go into this world as the people of God, and that God has called you as the church to go and bring this message, to live these ways of the kingdom. So we've got a moment, we've got a mission, but there's a missing link. Most Christians are excited about the potential of mission in this moment. Most Christians are excited about the fact that what if God moved in this moment? I felt about 3 years ago that a real shift was coming in the world, and actually things may look in the world more concerning, but it was actually at that moment that God said, I want you to start speaking about the potential of a renewal moment just at the point where everyone's talking about the triumph of secularism in the world. Speak about revival, renewal, and awakening. That took a lot of faith, because the world did not look like it was getting better. The church looked like it was actually shrinking and coming under pressure. And so as I spoke about these things, I could see there was a hunger in the world for God to turn things around, for churches to be rebirthed, for cultures to be brought back together, unified after a period of polarization, for justice to be addressed, for all these things to happen. People want the good stuff to happen, but there's a missing link. What's the missing link? Well, we live at this moment where there's a lot of people on the left who will blame people on the right, and people who blame people on the right blame people on the left. And there's a moment of great polarization in the world. And if you think about the West, in many ways, what the Western world is, and increasingly the globalized world, is a bird and it's got two wings, the left and the right wing. And is there a whole conversation about that? Yes, and we could take that apart. That's not my intent for this talk. But sometimes when we look at the other side and point the finger at the other side, we miss the actual body of the bird. And the body of the bird in the West is actually our core foundational thing, that we believe we're at the center of the universe. You know, it's common to the left and right. If you really scratch beneath the surface, both still bow down to the idol of the self, of the individual. And you see people who have this great heart to serve God, but there's these moments where there's these temptations and opportunities come before them for the things of the world and for the extension of themselves. Other people who even may become passionate about rectifying the ills of the world. How do we do justice in this world? They have a heart for the things of God's kingdom, but you can see the temptations come in another way, where it actually becomes, I'm caught up with the cause, and actually, I'm promoting this justice cause over here, but also I'm slightly promoting me. And so you see across churches, institutions, startups, whatever it may be, just ordinary people's lives, marriages, families, whatever it may be, increasingly the cult of the self is the missing link, which is actually undermining so many things that God wants to do in this world at this point in time. It is the hidden idolatry of the Western church. Now, I grew up, and I have these memories of my mum. My mum is a friendly person. She would talk to old people. And when I was a really young boy, my mum would make friends with these older people. She'd talk about her faith. They'd talk about their faith. And I have memories of visiting people. One key memory comes to me of my mum taking me as a young boy to a retirement village. And we went into this room. And in this room is this really old lady. And she was a missionary in China. as China was torn apart by its civil war, went through World War II, and she went and shared the gospel in China and lived as a missionary, as this single woman, sacrificed. And in the retirement village, she sat there, and I remember the room. I remember this blanket that she had. This memory is burnt into my mind. And she had this little notebook, and she had a blue ballpoint pen, and on it just these names and places and countries. And this woman, seemingly marginal in the eyes of the world. There is nothing less cool than an older lady in a room somewhere in a retirement village. That is just the least cool thing in the world. Yet she would spend hours and hours and hours a day praying. Pray for me. I'm here because of old people who died decades ago praying for me and my family. And there was a generation, if you go back, particularly to the start of the 20th century, who had this foundation of faith. And in many ways, we are standing on the shoulders of that generation of people who faithfully said no to self and yes to Jesus. And all the energy and institutions and trust funds and all these different things, which in a sense have powered the church forward in many ways, is just living off the fumes of that past generations. It's like a car which is flying along the road at a high speed, and you pull your foot off the accelerator and it keeps going for a while. But a car's coming to a stop at this point in time. And what we need is a new generation who will actually say no to the cult of self, the idol of individualism, and actually hear these words of Jesus and understand them. The world's value system, both left and right, American, Russian, Chinese, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, EU, South Africa, whatever, the nations of the world have got it wrong. The ideologies of the world have got it wrong. All of them fall short of the glory of God. Don't buy for a second that because that political system over there has got all these faults, that the one you believe hasn't got any faults. The gospel undoes all of them. The kingdom undermines them all. And at this moment, there is this invitation to build a new remnant in the world of faithful people. What is the missing link? The missing link is surrender to Jesus. There's a lot of people who want his peace. There's a lot of people who want to be in that emotional worship moment. There's a lot of people who want his answers to the problems of his life. But there's not a whole lot of people in this world who actually want to say yes, who actually want to put their life on the altar. Now, I'm not under any illusions that probably this message that I'm speaking right now may only reach 10 or 5% of people watching, because this is the challenge of the gospel. But I'm preaching for those 5 or 10 who want to say yes, because all it takes is a 5 or 10% of people in any place to actually turn things around. You may have heard the statement, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Or in the church, it's not the size of the church, it's not the size of the campus ministry, it's not the size of how many Christians are in a particular city or country. It's actually the amount of Christians who are willing to say yes with the whole of their lives. That's when the kingdom starts to move. So we have this moment, unprecedented shift in the world, technologically, economically, environmentally, culturally. We have a mission to go into the world, to preach the gospel, to live the ways of the kingdom. And you're going to be released into the world in all different fields which desperately need people who are going to follow God. We have a missing link of obedience. Now, some of you might be hearing this and go, yes, I want to say yes. Your heart wants to say yes to this. But you're thinking, my flesh is weak. I want to say yes, but I know all the different ways I fail. You may have in your mind, the religious spirit may be putting in your mind this concept of someone who is super perfect, who never makes mistakes, who turns up to every church service, has read every Christian book, just lives on loop in Christian podcasts, is the perfect worship singer, volunteers endless hours on your campus with your campus ministry, whatever. You may have this image of that person and say, I'm not that. The last point I want to make is you don't have to be that. We're in a moment. There is a mission. Yeah, there's a missing link. But you don't fill that missing link in your own strength. You can't fill that missing link through more religious activity, more effort, more hours put in. That doesn't get solved by human grunting hard work. You've got a Messiah. And at this point, what Jesus is saying is, follow me, follow my way. Jesus goes to the cross. Yes, the disciples are called to take up their cross, but they're not called to do the great work on the cross. Instead, they're simply called to bow their knee before he who has taken all of our failings, our sin, our brokenness, our insecurity, our anxiety, everything upon the cross he has taken. You do not have to do it in your own strength. You just have to say yes to him who can. This is a fundamental moment where God is calling a new generation without all of the glitz and the glamour, to actually say, I'm going to say yes, to surrender to him. And surrendering, we go before the altar, and we don't have to surrender things to be made right with God. He's done that for us. But we respond to his love by going before the altar and saying, I'm putting on this my dreams, my hopes, my expectations, the things which I look to aside from you. I give them all to you, Jesus. I bend my knee and I leave nothing behind. And that, yes, it requires some no's to the temptations of the world. But that yes is then this foundation of faithfulness which God begins to do a new thing in your life, in the church, in our countries, cities, and cultures. God begins to move again. Let's surrender to him. Let's say yes to him. That's the call.